Good morning and welcome. I'm Chris Stewart. I'm going to be your MC this morning. I just ask that you silence your phones. We're going to move quickly as we usually do through these sessions. We've got three presenters this morning, and we want to be able to leave some time for questions at the end. I do want to point out that the presentation from today, as well as the video from today, will be posted on the BBG website in the next couple days. The presentation probably later today, and the video in the next couple days. So you don't need to necessarily take furious notes today because it'll all get posted. We're pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly research series on topical research findings. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Today we're going to take a look at media use in Africa. I also want to give you a heads up that November 19th, we're going to be doing a session on digital media in the Middle East and North Africa. Another very interesting session. And then we'll take December off, and then we'll pick back up in January. And I believe we're going to be focusing in on Russia, another important market, sometime in January. So stay tuned on those dates. Our first speaker this morning is Ms. Sonia Glockel. She is the Research Program Manager at the BBG's International Broadcasting Bureau, and prior to assuming her current position, she served several years as a BBG's primary Africa research analyst. Please join me in welcoming Sonia.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, I'm not even a full-fledged speaker here today. I'm mostly here to welcome you on behalf of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. We are extremely pleased that we are able to continue to be able to make some of our vast data trove available to the public. Right now, we are also in the field in some very exciting places, so while I don't want to give away too much information, 2016 is going to be a good year to attend these research briefing events. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the BBG's research program, we do nationally representative surveys with generally very solid sample sizes of usually starting at 2,000. We have these large sample sizes because we do a lot of analysis on subgroups, and as you will see today, it's very helpful to have such robust sizes. You may have wondered when you first received the invitation for this event why we chose these 5 countries: Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. We didn't just do it because they make a very cool pattern on the map. They are indeed each of them is representative of a very different part of the internet use spectrum in Africa. They range from a quasi-monopoly mobile service provider market like Ethiopia, where we see that's very much on the bottom of the internet uptake, to a very liberal market such as Nigeria and Kenya. Nigeria and Kenya are often used in the very same breath when we talk about internet forerunners in Africa. But as you will see in a little while, there are some very important differences between those two markets when you look closer at how internet is taking up and by whom. But I don't want to give away too far, so I'm ready for the next speaker.
Thank you, Sonia. Our next presenter this morning is Mr. Ellington Kamba. Ellington is a research analyst at the BBG's International Broadcasting Bureau and is the BBG's primary Africa research analyst for all aspects of research in sub-Saharan Africa. Ellington has a lot of experience on the continent. He's actually headed to Nigeria tonight, so we were fortunate enough to have him join us this morning before he gets on a plane and heads to the continent. So please join me in welcoming Ellington Kamba.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sonia. If you'll excuse my voice a bit husky this morning, I don't know if I'm coming down with a cold, but thank you so much for the introduction. So to get into the discussion, first off, we want to give you a broad sort of sense of what we're going to be presenting today. The survey results that we're presenting today are really just to give you some understanding of the internet uptake in the different countries that Sonia has mentioned, the 5 countries that Sonia has discussed, what the activities are that they do online, and as well the devices they use to go online, and as well the social media websites that they visit on a regular basis. Now, to start off with, hopefully I can get this thing to work. Right. Is it working?
And also.
I guess. Okay, I just use that. Okay, Sonia's already taken you through why we chose those various countries. Africa is not a monolithic continent by any stretch of the imagination, and these countries really reflect what we were trying to get at when we were brainstorming around this discussion. The discussion around why we chose the countries and the population, sample sizes have been also been discussed. So I'll just go straight into the findings. As I said, Africa is online. The online population in Africa continues to grow, driven by urbanization, a rising middle class, expanded rural coverage, of course, a large youth population ready to embrace technology. For every 100 adults in Kenya, 22 use internet to access news at least once a week, 27 in Nigeria, and 19 in Zimbabwe. Of course, the current development of internet usage varies across our set sample. While some are much further down the path, others are still lagging behind. In Ethiopia, for example, 1 adult in 100 has home internet access. And if we go to past 7 days internet usage, we see that Ethiopia is at 3%. Now, if you look at Nigeria, 3 in 10 adults have used internet in the past 7 days. It is also worth noting at this point that home internet doesn't necessarily mean that this is fixed internet, and mobile phone does not mean smartphone. So let's be very clear as we go through the presentation. I will take you through now weekly internet usage by age, gender, location, and education. Africa happens to be the most youthful continent, and it comes as no surprise that weekly internet use is higher among adults aged 15 to 29, from as low as 6% in Ethiopia to 40% in Nigeria. If we look at weekly internet usage by gender, with the exception of Kenya, the gender internet gap is still wide in our sample countries. In Zimbabwe, for example, 25% of male adults use the internet weekly, with only 15% of female in that country using the internet weekly. The gap is even much larger in Nigeria. Conversely, in Kenya is one of the countries with a wide urban-rural internet divide. 44% of Kenyan urban adults use the internet weekly, and only 17% of rural Kenyan adults use the internet weekly. This divide is even more pronounced for countries with less internet usage, such as Cote d'Ivoire and Ethiopia. Other factors that may also be at play here may be because there is lack of cellular network coverage in some parts of the rural areas. So, of course, if there is lack of coverage, access to internet will be less. Time constraints, we know that, rural folks at times may be busy in their field, so less time to actually go online. Electricity is a challenge both in the urban areas, but more so in rural areas. So again, charging your phone may be a challenge, and just, getting online, given that there's a challenge with most rural areas are not on the national grid. If we look at education as a factor, education seems to play a role in who uses the internet. In all our sample countries, education, we find that those with some secondary education are more likely to use the internet. Again, we also looked at some factors that may affect usership here. Literacy, for example, expandable income, language skills. Now, all those are sort of related in some ways, and the common denominator there obviously is education. So if you are educated, you're more likely to get a good job, and if you have a good job, you're more likely to have expandable income to get on the internet. And literacy, of course, language skills. We know that a lot of the content that's online is either in English or French for the countries that we are discussing here. So those are some of the factors that you would have to factor in when you talk about internet usage. Now, Internet use by location among adults. Here we're talking about where they actually use the internet. Past research shows that internet access has been confined previously to internet cafes. But as this slide shows, 1 in 5 adults in Kenya and Nigeria now use internet at home. In Zimbabwe, for example, and in Nigeria, almost 1 in 10 adults now use internet in multiple locations. This has some implications in terms of how we share data, or information rather, with consumers now in Africa. Sensitive data that you may not necessarily have previously wanted to look at in, say, internet cafe, somebody over your shoulder, that's something now you can do online. And also, I think it also means better access to entertainment, staying in touch with family 24/7, because now you don't necessarily have to wait for to go to an internet cafe. And what about internet use by device? To put the internet potential for Africa into perspective, it is important to consider, It is important to consider the impact the mobile phone has had in transforming communication in Africa. 1 in 4 adults in Nigeria and 1 in 5 adults in Kenya 1 in 5 adults in Kenya and Zimbabwe use mobile phone devices to access the internet. And if you recall from our first slide, almost 76% of average adults have a working cell phone out of 100. But this is still limited. The devices that I use are pretty much limited to the mobile phone. As you can see from this slide, desktops, laptops, and tablets are virtually are non-existent in these markets. Let's talk about the social media websites visited among adults. Facebook is the application that continues to drive the majority of communication traffic from 3%, from as low as 3% in Ethiopia to 27% in Nigeria. Among those who access the internet, most are online for social networking, such as we talked about, the Facebook and WhatsApp as well. Emails, sharing videos, and looking up the latest news. In the previous slide, I forgot to mention. I forgot to mention that we're talking about, these are preset questions where we're asking them which of these websites, social media websites, do you visit. So it's not something that was spontaneously mentioned by the respondents. So please bear that in mind. And that's why I think if I go back to that slide, you'll notice that in Nigeria we don't have WhatsApp. But we actually did look at what social media websites they visit in Nigeria. And one of those, the local media website, social media website, is To Go. And that's at 20%. So just FYI. So in summary, internet users in Africa tend to be young, educated, and in urban areas. The probability of using the internet is also higher for male. We also find that internet usage patterns differ across gender and location. Of course, mobile phones are the major devices used to go online, both at home and in multiple locations. I will now turn over this to Magli to share with us the perceptions and attitudes of online and versus offline internet users. But before that, I think Chris will come and introduce her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellington. Our final presenter this morning is Ms. Magali Rowe. Magali is Gallup's Regional Research Director for Francophone Africa. In her present capacity, she manages all survey research operations across Francophone Africa. She's going to focus this morning on some findings from our Gallup World Poll, which is a 165-country initiative that we conduct with a core questionnaire, nationally representative samples, and she'll mirror the countries that Ellington just talked about. Magali?
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. So I want to build a little bit on what Sonia told us about the selection of these 5 countries. There are different, as you saw, in terms of not only their media usage, but they're also quite different in terms of size, population size, as well as in public opinion. So it will be very interesting to see what kind of differences we have. And the 5 countries, the 5 surveys that we've done, this is part of a much larger Gallup initiative to basically take the pulse of the world's residents in terms of key issues such as their well-being, job creation, and health. And so how do we do this? So I'm going to spend, I promise, less than 1 minute on methodology. We conduct nationally representative surveys in all of those countries, and we do this once a year. The sample sizes are usually 1,000 individuals in each country, and we use random selection probability to select where we're going to be interviewing people, so what we call the primary sampling units. Within the interview location, how we go about selecting the households where we're going to be doing this survey. And then within the household, how we go about selecting the person who is going to be taking the survey. And we do this in people's homes, so it's a face-to-face mode, and it takes about an hour. And so it's basically nationally representative samples that look at men, women, people who live in cities, people who live in rural areas, educated individuals, less educated people, truly representative of the largest socioeconomic groups in each country. And while we were thinking about how we were going to combine Whirlpool findings with the results that Ellington showed you, so looking at differences between people who are online and people who are offline, we wanted to think about topics that are critical to building strong civil societies. And these are the 3 topics that the Gallup Whirlpool track, but also topics that would looking at differences in terms of media usage. So if you're online versus if you don't use the internet, whether you would have different attitudes and different behaviors on these 3 core topics. And the topics are youth development. So this is about a measure of people's perceptions of a good, positive climate for young people to grow in the country. And it is based on 3 questions. And the questions we ask people whether they feel that whether they are satisfied or dissatisfied with the educational system in their communities, if children have the opportunity to learn and grow, and if children are treated with respect and dignity in their country. And the second topic is civic engagement. So it's a measure of civic participation. It is asking respondents if they've done something in the past month. So what would they have done? It's one of those 3 questions, so whether they have volunteered their time for an organization, if they have donated money to a charitable group, and if they have helped someone who needed assistance in the past month. And so the first 2 indices are really about positive, so the scores you'll see, will be indicative of the levels, in a positive way. But the third index, corruption, so this is about people's perceptions of how widespread corruption is, not only in the private sector, but also in government. And here, the higher you are, so the higher score, the more widespread perceptions of corruption are. So let's take a look at we'll start with youth development, and the way we calculate these indices, basically we, based on the answers that each respondent has given us, so out of 1,000, each respondent gets a score, and we average the scores to calculate the country score. So this is based out of 100. That would be the maximum score. So here we see that we have some variation. The spread between the highest country and the lowest country is about 23 points. We have Ethiopia and Zimbabwe that are essentially neck and neck, 78 and 77. Then it drops off a little bit, Kenya 71, and Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria are bringing up the rear. But it's overall they're pretty decent numbers in terms of how people perceive the climate for young people to grow in their countries. Now, we wanted to see if there were any differences in terms of people who have ever used the internet to inform themselves, what we call the online people, and then people who have never used the internet to inform themselves, so offline folks. And here, the differences are, very, very small. But we actually see that if we were going to make a very broad generalization, that people who are online tend to be less positive about youth development in their countries than people who are offline. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Maybe we can discuss this during the Q&A. We also wanted to see what kind of scores do we get on this index when it comes to demographics. And here, we don't see any big driver, in terms of, gender, age, education, urbanization level. We have one exception, and it is Nigeria. And in Nigeria, we see that people with less education tend to have more positive views about youth development than people who have at least a secondary level of education. And same for, again, in Nigeria, based on the urbanization level, those who live in cities are more likely to have positive views of how young people can learn and grow, develop, than people who live in rural areas. In terms of civic engagement, here the scores right away we can see are lower than the scores we had for youth development. And we also see that the spread between the highest score, lowest score is also slightly bigger. Kenya is really bubbling to the top at 52. Then it drops off considerably. In Nigeria, 38, 30, and then Zimbabwe and Cote d'Ivoire, again, are a bit of the laggards here on this index. Looking at how online versus offline individuals fare, here we see that people who have ever used the internet to inform themselves are more likely to have done some kind of civic action than people who are offline. And it's particularly true in Ethiopia, 45 versus 30. In terms of demographics, here again, we don't have a demographic driver of men would be more likely to do this, or women would be more likely to do this, education, more educated people. We have some exceptions, and that's why it's really important to look at these data at the country level, as opposed to making sweeping generalizations. In Nigeria, again, we have people more highly educated individuals who would be more likely to have reported having done a civic action in the past month than less educated people. And then in Ethiopia, we have men more educated people, as well as people who live in urban locations who would have done something related to civic participation. But we don't have the changes that you see. I really want to stress this. The other differences you see in the other countries are really not significant, and that's why we didn't highlight them on the slide. Now, the story gets even more interesting when you look at corruption index. So here, remember, this is based on 2 questions asking people whether they believe that corruption is widespread in a business and whether corruption is widespread in government. So it's essentially the higher the score, it's really indicative of a bad situation. You would hear this is an instance where you want to have a low score. So in Nigeria, we have basically almost everyone who believes that basically corruption is widespread in the private sector and in government. And the spread between Nigeria and Ethiopia is tremendous. It's over 40 points. Kenya, Zimbabwe also have pretty high scores. We do have a lot of high scores in other African countries, so that would be fairly typical. But at the same time, Côte d'Ivoire and Ethiopia are, much, much lower. So again, it's very hard to make sweeping generalizations, and it's much better. The information is much richer if you analyze it at the country level. So here, when we look at how online people versus offline people compare, we see that those who have ever used the internet are far more likely to believe that corruption is widespread in all aspects of their countries than people who have never used the internet. It is quite striking in Ethiopia. The exception, again, and I really want to emphasize this, is Nigeria. In Nigeria, we have 90 versus 92, and what that tells us is that it really doesn't matter. Corruption is something that people believe is part almost of their society. So on this particular index, there would be no differences in Nigeria between people who have used the internet to inform themselves and people who have basically kept the internet at bay. Looking at the corruption scores by demographics, here we do see one driver, and it is education. So the more education you have, the more likely you are to perceive that corruption is widespread in your country. And again, with the exception of Nigeria. 94, 90, here we really don't have a statistically significant difference. In Côte d'Ivoire, there we have of course, the education driver. But in Ethiopia, we also have a gender driver. So men are more likely to perceive corruption in the country, as well as younger people, 15 through 29, and of course, people who live in urban locations. So overall, we have seen that there are tremendous differences across just these 5 countries. And like Ellington pointed out, the continent is certainly not monolithic. And that's why, with the data, it really emphasizes the importance of looking at the analysis at the country level, because it yields much richer information. And I'm going to stop right here, and we'll be happy to take your questions and get your reactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magali. I'm going to start with a question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. And I'd ask if you've got a question, raise your hand. We've got a couple roving mics here. Just state your name and your organization. I want to ask the panel, because what was striking to me was the introductory slide on corruption. Ethiopia is one of the few countries in the region that's never been colonized. You've got some British colonies, and you also have a French colony, former colony. What's your takeaway from that? You've got much lower levels of perceived corruption in a country that's never been colonized.
I knew I was going to get this question. Ethiopia could be a case study. I would want to be very cautious to make generalizations, comparing, maybe a possible English system or former, colonial system versus a former French colonial system, because I know in a lot of other, French-speaking countries, corruption we do have some variation, but we have some countries that would be as high as Kenya, for example, maybe even as high as Nigeria, definitely as high as Kenya. And we would have also some lower countries. So, Ethiopia certainly has developed its own system. I would want to do more analysis to look at, what is the unique situation beyond the fact that it really wasn't colonized except for a very short period of time by the Italians at some point. But beyond that, I would want to be cautious about venturing, doing two blocks, the former French-speaking colonies versus the former, English-speaking colonies. Ellington, maybe you want to add to that?
I think that's a pretty sensitive sort of position to take. I think if we just use what we're talking about in terms of the data that we presented, and if we look at internet usage as a factor, what we're saying is that there are less, in Ethiopia, there's less people online. So their perceptions of what's happening around the world, their information sphere is, I guess, a lot smaller than, say, in other countries, based on what data we're presenting here. Outside that, I would not want to hazard to guess why there's less corruption in Ethiopia, or at least the perception of less corruption in Ethiopia.
Sonia, any thoughts?
I would very much say it is a matter of perception, and again, along with Ellington and Margalit, I didn't find it most striking that the perceived corruption in Ethiopia is significantly lower than in the other countries. What I found striking is that we see that once people actually go online, use the internet, then suddenly their perceptions get much more in line with the other countries. The perceived corruption index, I think, was then up to 60. So having access to information, I think, makes you more critical to what you see around you.
Okay, great. Okay, any questions from the audience? Mr. Foy.
Dan Foy with Gallup. I want to follow up on, I think Ellington started to talk about this a little bit, but with the issue of corruption in each of these countries, it seems to me that there's a driver at play here, that there's two sides to the coin. So on the one hand, these populations with internet access are going online, finding out information, maybe seeking out more information. On the other hand, in some of these countries, the media are more tightly controlled than in others. So there's a function of those who aren't online are receiving a limited slice of information. And Nigeria stands out as one where, with a robust domestic media environment, that radios and newspapers are certainly covering corruption just as well as your online sources are. So I'm wondering if the panelists could speculate about, within each of these countries, what do you think is one of those elements playing a larger role than the other in terms of populations finding new information versus not being able to find information in other sources?
Well, and I think I'll stick to the point I raised earlier, that it is about perception. And again, you said it's about your sphere of information, how big that information dump is in terms of where you're getting the information, who is talking. If say, local newspapers are talking about what's going on in the government, people are likely to take that up and discuss that. Maybe not so much in, say, Ethiopia as it is the case in Nigeria, where you have a more robust media outlay, as well as in Kenya, where there is also a very robust, active media. So for me, I really would say that it is about perception. It is about what is the conversation that's happening within those countries. I'm not sure exactly what the conversation is in Ethiopia in terms of corruption and how that is positioned.
Next question, right here.
Linda Nemec with Navante Group. I have two questions. One is, did you ask any questions about trusting the information that they found online? And then the second question is were you able to cover Northeast Nigeria? And if you did you have to change your sample selection?
Let me address the sample selection. We excluded 4% of the Nigerian population in a few conflict areas in the Northeast. But in the end, it turned out to be 4%. In terms of did we ask about trust in online sources versus traditional media outlets, I believe in this particular survey that was very, very full. Thank you again to all respondents who sat through 1 hour and 15 minutes of questions. I don't think we asked that, but we did ask about the level of trust in different media outlets specifically. We did notice there were some differences in trust of international versus domestic outlets, which is something we quite frankly see on a global scale.
Next question. Mr. Boyden.
If mobile phones are a primary way of accessing the internet, did you differentiate between smartphones and feature phones? And if so, what was the breakdown?
If I can take that again,
Go ahead.
just because I love that topic. We ask, every once in a while we will ask in a survey if people have a smartphone versus a feature phone. But what I find also very, very interesting then the definition of smartphone versus feature phone, which is something it's one of those things you know it when you see it. It's very difficult to make for a respondent to make that difference. So what we find the actual better indicator is when we ask people what activities do you pursue when you go online. Because also another thing is you may have the latest iPhone, but if you are right now in northeastern Nigeria in a rural location, you won't have access to a fast data network, so good luck streaming. So we ask people, rather than asking them necessarily about if they have a smartphone versus a feature phone, and also there are internet-enabled feature phones, let's not forget that, but we found that the uptake of sophisticated use of, you've seen that in one of Ellington's slides actually, of, say, streaming audio or video content is usually still, depending on who you talk to, it is, unless you are urban and young and educated, is not quite there yet.
Next question.
Good morning. Hailu with the African Translation. I know Kamba touched on this earlier, but if you could please talk a little bit about language proficiency and the difficulties and challenges people who are not proficient in French or English experience getting online. Thank you.
I'm going to take this because I love this topic.
You want to take it?
I'll take it, yeah.
Margaret, we'll start, and anything else add on to it.
So we, all over the African continent, when we do the Whirlpool surveys, we actually use 80 languages. So it's just a fraction of the 3,000 plus languages that are spoken on the continent. But we do cover, basically in a given country, it would be groups. We want to be covering the groups where the languages are the most widely spoken. So the process that we go through is basically we start with an English questionnaire that is then, if it's, in, say, Nigeria, for example, that questionnaire is then sent for translation, and we translate the English questionnaire into 4 languages in Nigeria. Then the 4 translations are back translated into English to see if we have basically, in the translation, we are going to be asking people who will not be able to answer the survey in English, if we're going to be asking them what we want to be asking them, what we conceived in the questionnaire. For the French-speaking countries or the Portuguese-speaking countries, we start with the English questionnaire, and then we translate it into French or Portuguese, and those versions are then used to translate, to do the translations into the local languages. So that's a very involved process. It's time-consuming, but we feel that it is necessary to make sure that our respondents are going to be able to understand what it is that we want to be asking them about.
Next question. Mr. Marszalek.
Magali, just circling back to corruption, can you give us a little bit of background on the instrument? How was that question asked, or did you give any definition of corruption? Because I'm wondering if in some of the countries there's a, frankly, wide knowledge of what it is.
Okay, so we do not define corruption for the respondent. The question is just as you, if you can, Chris, if you can flip back a few slides to the corruption all the way
To the definition.
get the wording of the.
Oh.
Two more. Here we go. So the way you have it formulated there is corruption widespread within businesses located in, and then we name the country or not. And it's a dichotomous question. So it's basically a yes or no. The respondent has the option to say, I don't know, or refuse to answer. On this item, we, especially in Nigeria, people do give an answer. And then the second question, and we start with businesses, and then the next question is about government. Is corruption widespread throughout the government in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, or not? That's how it's formulated.
In the countries where there are low scores, did you get a lot of people deferring the question?
On this question, we don't really get refused or don't knows. It's actually one of the questions that it's fairly straightforward, even though the concept of corruption can be complicated. But somehow, and in cognitive interviews, none of the questions that you see here have just been, asked for the first time. These have been tested in many different markets to make sure that we have, people really understand what we are trying to measure here.
Paul, we have a series in the former Soviet Union beyond just these two questions that really dives into corruption and bribery, and actually is scenario-based. And one of the follow-up questions is, if they participated in a bribery activity or themselves, did it actually work? So we're looking at the efficacy of the bribery as well. So that's a fascinating series that from time to time we'll actually post articles on Gallup.com on that series. But it's too long a series to be able to add into sub-Saharan Africa. Next question, right here.
Alex Pompey from IREX. Did you come across many respondents who identified that they had not been using the internet, but had been using Facebook? The reason I ask is initiatives like internet.org or Facebook Zero, some people might be conceptualizing the internet differently than Facebook, whereas here in Western contexts, we find those to be the same thing.
If I may take this again, because I think it's an excellent question. In fact, based on, this is something we have perceived in the past in our questionnaires quite frequently. Not huge differences, but always a couple of percentage points here and there. And based on this feedback that we've gotten last year, we've completely revamped our questionnaire in the internet section. We have merged everything, and now we are very much we've very much let go of definitions of internet, mobile phones, social networking, all those concepts that really don't matter to respondents. What matters to respondents is things like Facebook. That's something, it's a concrete thing. They know what it is, yes or no. So really good question.
Hi, Kate Nieper from BBG. I wanted to come back to your question about language, because I think you were asking about whether people's knowledge of English or French impacts their ability to go online and what they do online, and I'm also interested in that topic. So I was wondering if Ellington or Sonia could come back to that.
Oh, I wasn't sure whether or not that your question had been answered in full, but yes, we, based on our findings, we are saying that in terms of the countries that we sampled, so we had some French countries, English countries, as well as Amharic in the Horn of Africa. What we're saying is that education is a prerequisite to actually going online. And when you talk about education, you're also talking about language of record in some of these countries. So it could be French or English or Amharic in the Horn of Africa. So a lot of the content we know online is either French, English, or depending on which part of the world you're in. That then is a factor that drives people going onto these websites. So again, there may be vernacular languages, some blogs, for example, that are in vernacular, where people will go there. But predominantly what we are seeing is that there is a relationship between those that visit internet or at least access internet to education. And again, if you look at it, we're talking about skills, language skills, as well as literacy. So,
and with only some exceptions, like I'm thinking of Hausa, Swahili, most of the languages are not written languages. So, and most people could not read in, say, Zarma or, you know, I'm thinking of a language in a country where I was recently, Punu in Gabon. It's not going to be written, so it would be very hard for them, for respondents to even, you know, be able to read, even if they could come across a site that would be in that vernacular language. So it's going to be mainly English, you know, French, Swahili, Hausa, you know, and a few other, you know, more widely spoken languages.
Right here.
Hi, thank you very much. I just have what was most surprising to me was centered around civic engagement. And if folks that are higher educated are on the internet more, but then internet users rated lower in civic engagement.
Higher.
Higher.
Higher? Okay, never mind. I read the sheet.
I think you're thinking of the youth development, that was lower for those who were online.
Okay, and how do you reconcile that then?
So I'll start, and then you can, you know, build on it. I think that perhaps people who are internet users, even if they don't travel, they may have higher expectations because they have been exposed to more information about children, how young people are treated in maybe neighboring countries, in other parts of the world. And even if children are not treated poorly and have opportunities to learn and grow, it still sets a much higher bar. So that may be where an instance where having access to information is actually making people feel that, well, no, in my community, things are not as good for children as they could be, because I've seen that in other places, things are a lot better.
Very much along the lines of what Magali had said. We do have the good fortune that sometimes when we see oddities in our data, we get to do qualitative research to follow up on it. And what we have generally found is really the internet opens up a world of opportunities, but it also does make you more demanding, because you can suddenly see, well, this is what I have, and this is what else is out there in the world. So I personally wasn't terribly surprised that internet users would have a lower perception of how good the opportunities for youth development are in their country.
Do we have a final question? We'll take two.
Hi, Nader Nekvasil from Gallup. So in the news yesterday, Mark Zuckerberg pretty boldly announced that he was going to beam the internet into Africa. So basically, my question is, would beaming the internet in Africa really solve Africa's problems with internet usage? Or are we looking at it the wrong way in terms of building an infrastructure from the ground up? And even in rural America, we see that there might not be enough buy-in for the internet because it's just not necessary for their way of life. So I'm wondering if you asked African residents whether or not they see the value in the internet and if they even if they feel they need internet. So.
Start off here. Well, one thing that I think, if you beam the internet in Africa, it will solve two problems that we constantly still see. A is the problem of, and assuming that these will be stable, high-speed connections, which that's an assumption I'm just making right now. So A, you will have a stable high-speed connection that enables you to take advantage of the full opportunities that the internet has, such as watching videos, streaming audio. But also, what we often forget, because we come from a country where there's flat rates, right? In many African nations, you do pay by the what is that, megabyte, gigabyte? You'd actually pay by use. So, and that is actually, we've seen that as an impediment to certain populations. Somebody might be willing to, check sports scores because that's important and that doesn't cost very much, but they might be less willing to, let's say, watch a 30-minute about polio vaccines. So if Mark Zuckerberg can solve that, that's already going to be a big step forward.
Yeah, I agree. It's a cost issue. I think, in as much as you can beam internet, you will have, and we already talked about also the devices, whether or not they'll be able to actually get the devices to actually access the internet. So.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about your findings from Ethiopia. So I know that market is very highly regulated, but can you speculate on why some of the usage is so low, besides that reason?
You mean why the internet usage is so low? Well, one thing which we should have actually mentioned a little bit earlier already in this presentation is the data is not brand new. So that's actually very important, especially when it comes to internet usage. Even if we had gone in the field half a year ago, by now things would already have changed. The other issue that I think is an impediment in Ethiopia is obviously the monopoly of mobile service providers. You might have a similar situation in a country like Zimbabwe, but then you can take mobiles in from South Africa. So, which is more difficult in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, obviously, with its topography, very hilly, you have valleys that don't get anything. And we are obviously very interested, for example, also in radio and TV reception. We see actually, and I think our friends at Gallup, when they just wrote our recent reports, they called it media dead spots. There are such villages where you don't get anything. So that, I think, might be one of the reasons.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today. One final reminder, if we can put that up on the screen. Our November 19th event focused on the digital environment in Middle East, North Africa. Let's give one final round of applause to our presenters. We're adjourned.